This is from March of 2023. I was heading home after a long evening catching up with friends while in Preston, England. The night had been great, but I was exhausted and ready to be in bed. As I left the pub, I realized that my phone was hanging on by just a thread, left with only 5% battery. I knew it wouldn't last long enough to order an Uber or Lyft, let alone wait for one to arrive, so I needed another option. That's when I spotted a taxi idling near the curb. It was one of those nondescript black cars with a green dashboard light. I'd seen plenty like it in town before. I hesitated for just a moment because it didn't have that flashy branding of the bigger companies. But with my phone about to die, I figured I didn't have much of a choice. That's when the driver rolled down the window and asked, "Need a ride?" "Yeah, thanks," I replied, climbing into the back seat. He seemed friendly enough, maybe in his mid-30s, with a clean-shaven face and a neatly pressed shirt. As we pulled away, he struck up casual conversation. "Heading home after a big night out?" he asked. "Yeah, just catching up with some old friends," I answered, trying to keep things light. I didn't want to seem rude, but something about this man had already ruffled my feathers. Maybe it was how he glanced at me in the rearview mirror a little too often, or how his ever-present smile felt forced. The drive started uneventfully enough, but about 5 minutes in, I realized that something was off. He passed a turn that should have taken us toward my street. "I think you missed my turn," I said, voice deliberately steady. "No worries," he replied, waving it off. "This is a quicker route." I didn't press the issue immediately, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But when he turned onto a dark, empty road leading toward a more isolated part of town, that's when my unease turned to alarm. There were no streetlights, no other cars, and no sign of the bustling neighborhoods that we'd just left. "I think you're going the wrong way," I said again, this time a bit more forcefully. "Relax," he said, with a tone much colder now. "I know what I'm doing." My pulse quickened. My phone's battery was dangerously low. Maybe just enough for one call, if I was lucky. I unlocked it and texted my roommate. "In a taxi. Feels off. If I don't text back soon, something's wrong." I prayed the message would send before the battery gave out. As we drove deeper into this desolate area, I noticed this man's demeanor start to shift. He stopped trying to make small talk and started gripping the wheel tighter, his eyes darting between the road and the rear view. My heart was pounding as I realized he was taking me somewhere that I didn't want to go. I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "My boyfriend's a cop, and he's expecting me to check in soon." It was a lie, but I hoped that it would make him think twice. His expression didn't change immediately, but I could see the gears turning in his head. I pressed on, acting like I was now calling someone on my phone. "Hey," I said loudly as I placed it to my head. "I'm almost home, just a few minutes away." That seemed to rattle him. He slowed the car, and after a tense silence, he muttered, "Fine, let's get you home then." The drive back to civilization felt agonizingly long, but eventually I started seeing familiar street signs. When we were close to my apartment, I lied and told him I needed to stop at the corner store to grab something. He pulled over, and I didn't wait for the car to even stop. I jumped out, leaving the door open behind me as I sprinted inside the shop. After dilly-dallying in the shop for as long as I could, and being certain that he'd driven off, I walked the rest of my way home, shaking with adrenaline now. My roommate was waiting for me, I'm sure worried sick after getting my text. Once through the door, I explained everything, and we decided to report the incident to the police the next day. Months later, in June of 2023, I saw that cabbie's face again, but this time it was on the news, accompanied with a name, Nazim Asmal, and he'd been arrested for using fake taxi credentials to lure unsuspecting women into his car before taking them to secluded areas and assaulting them. The details of his crimes were horrifying. He had a history of targeting women late at night, preying on their trust in what they thought was a safe mode of transport. Investigators revealed he'd been operating in Preston and Darwin for months, if not longer. and had been linked to multiple attacks. Hearing this, I felt a wave of nausea. This was a confirmation of just how close I had come to becoming one of his victims. Nazim's trial brought to light the full extent of his predatory behavior. Multiple women came forward with harrowing accounts of being assaulted after being picked up by his fake taxi. In October of 2023, he was convicted on multiple charges, including sexual assault and kidnapping. While he received a sentence of more than 15 years in prison, that punishment felt woefully short for the trauma that he had caused. Even though he's now behind bars, I can't get away from the thought that there are others out there like him, just waiting for an opportunity to exploit someone's trust. And if there's one thing that this experience taught me, it's to never ignore my gut. That night could have ended very differently if I hadn't stayed alert and acted quickly. To anyone listening, please be cautious when using taxis or ride shares. Always verify the person's credentials. Share your location with someone you trust. And above all, make sure to listen to your instincts. Awful people like Nazim Ismail exist, and they thrive on complacency. So it's best to stay safe. It was late summer in 1998 when I made the impromptu decision to visit Yosemite National Park. I was freshly divorced and desperately needed to clear my head, to lose myself in the serene beauty of towering granite cliffs and cascading waterfalls. I booked a modest room at a motel in El Portal, California, a reasonably priced stopover just outside the park. I didn't know it then, but this trip would haunt me for the rest of my life. The Cedar Lodge Motel was quiet, tucked away in a picturesque corner of the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was nothing fancy, just a practical place for visitors like me, eager to experience Yosemite's wonders without breaking the bank. I recall that when I checked in, the woman at the front desk was friendly, but preoccupied, juggling phone calls and guest requests. I remember thinking the motel had a comforting small-town feel. It was the kind of place that felt almost familiar, even though I'd never been here before. I arrived in the early evening, tired from the long drive, and as I unloaded my luggage from the trunk of my car, I noticed a man standing by one of the motel's utility sheds. He was tall, lean, with an awkward posture that made him look perpetually uncomfortable. He wore a faded maintenance uniform and carried a toolbox, which he seemed to be fiddling with more for show than out of necessity. His hair was long and unkempt, and he had a curious look in his eye, almost as if he was sizing me up. He caught me staring, and to my surprise, he gave a small wave. I think that was accompanied with a good evening, or something to that effect. His voice was low and pretty casual. I nodded politely, offering a quiet hi before hurriedly grabbing my bag and heading off to my room. Now, there was something about him that I couldn't place, a faint air of tenseness that set my nerves on edge. But I dismissed it. He was just a handyman, probably working late, and I was likely imagining things after so much time on the road. Over the next 2 days, I explored Yosemite, marveling at all of its natural beauty. The park was everything I'd hoped for, tranquil, humbling, and exactly the escape that I needed. But my nights back at the motel were far less serene. That handyman seemed to be everywhere. I'd see him near the lobby when I picked up a soda from the vending machine. I caught him sweeping near my front door when I returned from an errand. Once, as I sat outside my room enjoying the cool evening air, he walked past with eyes that lingered just a second too long. Each time he saw me, he tried to make small talk, asking where I was from, if I was visiting Yosemite alone, and how I was enjoying my stay. His questions felt intrusive, like he was gathering information rather than just making casual conversation. When I told him I was traveling alone, a mistake I now realize, his expression flickered. I could see that caught his interest. I remember him telling me that I should be careful, with a tone that shifted from friendly to nearly condescending. A lot of people get lost out here. I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. I told him that I'd keep that in mind before retreating to my room. I locked every lock on that door that night and double-checked it at least twice. On my third night at the lodge, something happened that I still can't quite fully explain. I'd been out late, soaking in the last bits of daylight in Yosemite, and didn't return to the motel until well after dark. As I walked up to my room, I noticed that the doormat was slightly off-center. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I got this sinking feeling in my gut. A few of my belongings had been moved. A pair of sandals I'd left by the bed were now in the middle of the room, and my toiletry bag was unzipped on the bathroom counter, even though I'm OCD about having all my stuff neat and zipped up. The air felt heavy, almost as if someone had been in the room just moments before me. My first instinct was to check the windows, but they were all locked from the inside. The only other entrance was a door that I had just walked through. Had I forgotten to lock it before I left? Or had someone been inside? I wasn't sure, but I had this gnawing sense of dread that I couldn't easily shake. Later that night, as I lay in bed, still thinking about that odd feeling I had, I heard a faint shuffling coming from right outside my room. This made me freeze, and I remember barely breathing as I strained to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, as if someone was pacing right outside my door. Then, the doorknob rattled. I bolted upright, my heart now pounding in my chest. The rattling stopped, but the heavy silence that followed was even more unsettling. I tiptoed to the peephole, but whoever had been out there just a moment before was now gone. The next morning, I checked out early. I had had enough, and my nerves were thoroughly shot. I told myself that it was all in my head, that I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. Months later, after trying my hand at a fresh start in life, I just moved to the Pacific Northwest, where I still call home today. I've always been a fan of the outdoors, so the ample forests, trails, and space here absolutely fit me. But for a while in the 90s, I was a bit reclusive. I didn't have cable, didn't have many friends to talk to on the phone. All I had was my house, my dog, and the morning paper that kept me at least slightly aware of the happenings outside of my four walls. Well, one morning, I just sat down with my paper and coffee when one of the articles stopped me cold. Actually, it wasn't the article itself. It was the black and white picture that accompanied it. It was a photo of that handyman from the Cedar Lodge Motel. I learned then that his name was Cary Stainer, and he had been arrested for the brutal murders of 4 women in the Yosemite area. This included a mother and daughter, as well as a teenage foreign exchange student. I felt a wave of nausea as the memories flooded back. The way he had watched me, his unnerving questions, and the incident with my door. Whether it was luck or something else, it seems like I had narrowly escaped being one of his victims. Stainer confessed to the murders in chilling detail, revealing a long-standing obsession with violent fantasies. His crimes were calculated and driven by a disturbing desire for control and dominance of others. Stainer was convicted and sentenced to death in 2002. He remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison in California. His story is made even more chilling by his family history. His younger brother, Stephen, was kidnapped as a child and held captive for 7 years before escaping his kidnapper. The media frenzy surrounding Stephen's ordeal overshadowed Cary, leaving him with feelings of neglect and inadequacy that he later claimed contributed to his violent tendencies. Though Stainer's case is infamous, and he held a willingness to admit what he did, authorities suspect that he may have had other victims, women who disappeared without a trace while in the park. The thought that he could have targeted me still wakes me up with a cold sweat on occasion. To this day, I still can't stay in motels. The creak of a door, the sound of footsteps outside, all of it takes me back to that night at the Cedar Lodge. Cary Stainer is locked away and will remain that way for the rest of his life. But at times, the guy lives rent-free in my head. This experience taught me that evil doesn't always look the way you expect. It can easily wear the face of someone you'd pass by without a second thought. And that is downright terrifying. I'm nearing the age of 50 now, but I'll never forget the summer of 1993. I was 16, and like most teenagers, I was happy to be out of school for a couple of months. That summer, I decided to spend a week with my grandfather, who lived alone in a small house in Shropshire, England. He was a widower by then, my grandmother having passed away a few years earlier, and I knew that he could use some company. Plus, I love my grandpa. He was one of those no-nonsense types who still had a twinkle of mischief in his eye, always quick with the story about the good old days. His home was in a quiet village, kind of place where everything always felt safe and orderly. But as I'd come to learn, danger doesn't always care about village charm or quiet streets. It was well past midnight, one of the nights that I was visiting, when I was jolted awake by a series of muffled thuds. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling. It creaked and groaned like an orchestra when the wind picked up. But this was different. It wasn't the kind of sound you could easily dismiss. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and coming from inside the house. I slipped out of bed, careful to be as quiet as possible, and crept down the hallway towards his room. The door to his bedroom was open, and I could see movement coming from inside. That's when I froze. There was someone in there with him. There was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing over my grandpa's bed. In the little bit of light coming in through the window, I saw this man raise something over his head and bring it down with terrifying force. I didn't think, I just acted. I knew that my grandfather had a metal fire poker underneath the light switch in his room, and I grabbed it without hesitation. Adrenaline surging, I burst into the room and swung the poker as hard as I could, right at that man's head. It connected with the most sickening crack I've ever heard, causing him to stumble backwards. For a moment, I thought that I'd knocked him out, but he recovered quickly. That's when he turned to face me, and our eyes locked. I couldn't quite make out his face in the darkness, but it was the look in his eyes that I'll never forget. The rage was easy to decipher, but it was the shock that caught me off guard, like he was surprised to encounter anyone else in the house. I reared back to take another swing, and that's when he shoved me hard, sending me sprawling onto the floor. And for a moment, I thought I was going to catch a severe beating too. But he bolted out of the room, and I could hear his heavy footsteps racing towards the back door. As soon as I was sure that he was gone, I scrambled to my feet and went to my grandpa's bed. He was still alive, but he was in terrible shape. He'd taken several blows to the head and body, and blood was seeping from a gash on his temple. I remember shouting for him to stay awake, begging him not to close his eyes while I fumbled with the landline to call for an ambulance. The police arrived shortly after the paramedics. They searched the house and the surrounding area but found no trace of the man. He'd left behind his weapon, which turned out to be an iron rod, but it was completely clean of fingerprints. The officers told us that it looked like a break-in, likely someone targeting my grandpa, and they believed the attacker hadn't expected anyone else to be in the house. My grandpa survived. He was never quite the same after that night. His injuries healed, but the fear lingered. He stopped sleeping in his bedroom, opting for the couch in the living room instead, and he had extra locks installed on every door and window in his house. It broke my heart to see him like that. This strong, proud man, reduced to living in terror. For a long time, I tried to put that night behind me. But then, in 1996, as a young adult myself, something caught my attention. A man named Robin Ligas was arrested and convicted for the murder of Robert Young, a man beaten to death during a robbery in Shrewsbury. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a shocking crime, yes, but it felt distant. But then I read more about Ligas's MO. He targeted 75-year-old Young, breaking into his home at night and using brutal force to swiftly overpower him before taking his life. That brought all those feelings from 1993 rushing back. Could it have been him? Could Robin Ligas have been the man who broke into my grandpa's house that night? The timing, the similarities, even the location, it all lined up too perfectly to ignore. I'll never know for sure, but deep down, I believe it was him. The thought that I came face to face with a man who went on to kill others is something that I still grapple with. What only adds to this is that in 2011, Ligas was convicted of 2 more murders from 1994. Brian Coles, who was beaten and left in his burning home, and Trevor Bradley, whose body was found in a burned-out car. The method of both killings, blunt force trauma, likely from a metal bar, as well as the targeting of vulnerable men, were eerily similar to what I'd witnessed in 1993. It's hard not to think about how differently that night could have ended. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't woken up when I did, my grandpa might not have survived. And if Ligas, or whoever it was, had stayed after he knocked me over, I might not be here to tell this story. Robin Ligas spent the last 16 years of his life in prison after being found unfit to stand trial for his later murders due to dementia. He died in custody in 2022, and with him went any chance of ever knowing just how many lives he truly destroyed. Police have speculated that there may be more victims out there, unclaimed and unconnected, scattered across the 90s and before. This experience changed me. It made me realize that that feeling of safety we all take for granted is actually an illusion. My grandpa lived in a quiet village, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But monsters don't care about quiet villages. All they care about are their opportunities. I'm proud of what I did that night. As scared as I was, I fought back, and I saved my grandpa's life. But I'll always carry the weight of that night. Was it Robin Ligas? Like I said, I'll never know for sure. But whoever it was, they didn't expect a teenager with a fire poker. And for that, I'm grateful.